everyone, my name is Kaylee and I'm a grief counselor who helps families support each other through the very difficult emotions that come along with grief. Today we're going to be reading my book, Charlie, Sue, and Marmaduke, A Story of Grief for Parents and Children. Throughout this story, you're going to hear about my dog, Charlie Sue, and her journey as she tries to understand the feelings that came along when she lost her best friend, Marmaduke. Let's get started. Snuggle up, grab a blanket, and get cozy. Are you ready? Let's get started. This story is dedicated to our dog, Duke, who died in 2016. Who are you thinking about as I read this story about Charlie, Sue, and Marmaduke? Charlie, Sue, and Marmaduke were an odd pair. Charlie Sue was a sweet little thing with a short nose that caused her to snort when she breathed. Her hair was thick, and every time she shook, she'd leave a trail of fur behind. She was made for lounging and cuddling in her favorite blanket in the sunshine. Marmaduke was just the opposite. In his younger years, he could not sit still. He was made for running through fields and tracking down birds. But now that he was much older, he had slowed down and his hair had fallen out almost completely, showing his freckled skin underneath. Nowadays, he could be found lounging in the sun with his best friend, Charlie Sue. They spent their days rolling in the grass, sharing bowls of food, and snuggling by the fire at the end of a long and happy day together. Marmaduke truly loved Charlie Sue. He was protective of his best friend, making sure no one could ever hurt her, even as his body continued to slow. One cool fall day, Marmaduke left the house and did not come back. Charlie Sue became concerned as she saw Mom and Dad cry. They hugged her tightly, but she didn't understand. Where was her best friend? She decided that she needed to go find him. She left her home and began her journey to find Marmaduke. As Charlie Sue got further away from home, the sky became very foggy and she struggled to see her paws in front of her. She stumbled through rocks and puddles, calling out to her best friend. "Marmaduke, where are you?" she yelled. "Please come home." She felt confused and afraid as she wandered further and further away from home. She didn't know where she was going and felt fearful that she would never find her best friend. As Charlie Sue continued to wander through the fog, she saw a clearing off in the distance. There was a beautiful meadow full of thick grass. She was sure that was where Marmaduke went. But how do I get there, she thought. She ran toward the meadow and quickly found that her paws were cold, wet, and muddy. She looked down at her feet and then slowly across the horizon. What lay ahead of her was a large marsh, but it wasn't just any marsh. It was filled with dirty water, weeds, and mud. Worst of all, it was freezing cold. Charlie Sue did not want to get into the marsh, so she decided to find a way around. But the shore all around was too steep and slippery. She kept falling into the marsh. Then she decided to float across it on a log. But each time she pushed herself and the log into the marsh, the log began to roll, throwing her back into the marsh to start all over again. She was cold, wet, and frustrated. How could she get to Marmaduke? Finally, she called out for help. Perhaps there was someone on the other side who could help her. Help me, please," she cried. "I need to get to the meadow on the other side of this marsh. Can someone please help me?" Charlie Sue heard a faint voice that sounded like it was coming from the other side of the marsh. But what was it saying? She listened closely. "Get in the water," the voice said. "You must go through the marsh. There is no way around it." That was not what Charlie Sue wanted to hear, but she knew it was the truth. She had already tried everything else she could think of. Charlie Sue knew she had no other choice than to get into the cold, muddy marsh. Finally, Charlie Sue got up the courage to wade into the cold, muddy water. The mud at the bottom made each step sticky. She had to find rocks at the bottom to stand on so she could keep her head above water. As she made her way through the marsh, she was overcome with sadness. She began to cry. "Oh, Marmaduke, why would you leave me to go through this alone? I need you here to help me." She cried for her friend, and she cried for herself. She did not want to go through this marsh by herself. As she continued to make her way through the marsh, she began to wonder why Marmaduke left. Was it something that she had done? Was he angry with her? What would have made him leave her all alone? As time went on, Charlie Sue waded further and further into the marsh, but she never seemed to get any closer to the meadow on the other side. She felt as though she had been working her way through this muddy marsh for too long. And just when she began to think her journey through the marsh would never end, the water began to get shallower. Charlie Sue had found the shore. Charlie Sue dove into the very lush patch of grass, letting her little body be warmed by the sun. As she lay there warming, she began to think of Marmaduke and was comforted by the many memories they shared. Those warm memories washed over her just like the sunshine. For the first time since Marmaduke had disappeared, Charlie Sue smiled. She smiled for her memories. She smiled for her friend. She smiled for the gift of having him in her life. Charlie Sue still missed Marmaduke, but she understood that he couldn't be found. He was not coming back, but she still felt him around her, in her memories, and in the sun shining down on her in that meadow.